All right. Good morning and welcome back to another Friday. So, war. What's a good war? Right? What's that? Yeah. The old song goes, war, what's it good for? Absolutely nothing. Morality, we argue, that's not necessarily true. We talked a lot about justice on a very individual level past few classes. About how the individual interacts with one another, how the individual interacts with the overarching organizations, especially governments, right? Well, we need to also look at justice on the perspective of nations and states. It is not just something done on an individual basis, but also on a communal basis. We gathered together into organized states, organized nations, are called to practice justice within our boundaries. And if we have the capacity, the ability to practice, to seek to impose it or to spread it with others as well. War is the ultimate action between nations. It is not the only action by far, but it is the ultimate course of action that one nation can take against another. Now, of course, not every war is done for a just reason, whether looked at overall or whether looked at in the details. But more often than not, the argument is usually made, whether on good reasons or not, that war is a response to injustice and a means of trying to reestablish peace. Right? The opposite of war is usually peace. Now, what though is peace? How would you define peace? Don't just tell me it's the opposite of war or the absence of war. How would you define what peace is? What would be your definition?
Comes to mind is a similar definition of justice, like a regulation with others.
Right relation, perhaps, yes. Others? Other thoughts, other ideas? Yeah?
A period of time when people's quality of life increases.
Quality of life increases. Yeah. Others? Other thoughts, other ideas? Right.
Where there's no fighting.
There's no fighting. Those are beginning to get towards a good understanding of what peace really is. The most basic definition that we can start with to understand what peace is comes to us from the ancient Christian philosopher Augustine of Hippo. He calls peace the tranquility of order. Peace is the tranquility of order. What does that entail, though? What is this tranquility of order? Well, in the first place, like Riley said, it is the absence of conflict. There could be no peace if there is conflict, internal or external. We can't claim to have inner peace if we are conflicted, turmoiled within ourselves, within our psyches, our minds. It is the same for any nation, any state. You cannot be at peace if you are being bombarded or attacked from without or even turmoiled from within. So first of all, peace is an absence of conflict. But it must be more than that. It must be more than just this absence of conflict. Another characteristic of peace is to possess the serenity experienced due to that absence of conflict. So flowing immediately from that absence of conflict, there is that serenity. That doesn't always happen immediately after you stop fighting. Right? If you ever broken up or seen a fight in school broken up, the two parties that are usually fighting are usually, even though they're not at each other's throats, they are still agitated. If you let them go, they might start going again. That serenity that comes with the absence of conflict. Then flowing from that absence of conflict, flowing from the serenity that begins to be experienced by that one begins to enter into a calm that accompanies the agreement of wills. For in a community, for a community to have peace, to avoid conflict, there must be agreement of wills. And associated with that is a great sense of calm. It is this peace that is ultimately the foundation of every well-ordered society. For human beings do not normatively desire conflict. Conflict only arises because there is disagreement of the wills. There is disagreement about how things should be or should be done. To the point that they are seen at times as fundamental differences. This is different than maybe polite disagreements. We seem to see the other side as doing something that is gravely evil. And hence, in our minds, whether it's right, whether it's true or not, that therefore, we must respond in this way. And this goes not just for nations, it goes for individuals as well. We can only be at peace ourselves or with those around us if there is that agreement of wills, or at least the agreement to disagree, perhaps, to disagree in peace. Now, there are various ways to respond as an individual and even as a nation to war, to the idea of war. There are many ways to do that. There is, in fact, a scale of responses of how we can do that. We start with the least aggressive. Phrase it that way. The least aggressive. And this is absolute pacifism. Absolute pacifism can be described as non-resistance. as I said before, this can be done by individuals as well as nations. So those who practice absolute pacifism will not take up arms for any reason, nor even in a certain sense will they offer any sort of resistance to injustice. We'll distinguish between this and pacifism a little bit later. But absolute pacifism is the willful non-resistance of any action towards oneself, whether that oneself is an individual, whether that oneself is a nation. There are certain Christian groups who practice absolute pacifism. They will say that they are placing their hope or their trust in God. That God is the ultimate revenger. Or in another perspective, those perhaps less Christian, or those less focused on God, will say, any human attempt at justice ultimately fails, they will say. It cannot be done perfectly. Those Christians will often quote from the gospel. In the midst of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, verses 39, he offers a teaching about turning the other cheek. He says, when one strikes you on your cheek, turn and offer them the other cheek. And many who advocate this position say, Jesus is telling us not to resist injustice. To accept it, to suffer through it, as it were. And that God will be the one who ultimately deals with them. So going kind of down into, going, or in a certain sense, like I say, up the scale of aggressivity, we go from absolute pacifism to just vanilla old pacifism. Yeah. I always want to write it as pacificism. Now, pacifism versus its absolute form, this is offering perhaps resistance to injustice, but non-violent resistance. Who's perhaps the greatest exemplifier of non-violent resistance in the United States history? Martin Luther King Jr., right? He did not organize riots. He did not organize burning things down. He organized marches. He organized sit-ins, bus rides, to resist injustice. And he succeeded in a great part in his time. He's not the only one. Who is the example before him that inspired him? Who's that? Gandhi, yes. Gandhi in the 40s, resisting British unjust occupation of India. He didn't organize armies. He didn't organize rebellions. He organized fasts and marches. Abstinence from salt. It worked. So pacifism is to resist in non-violent ways. So hence one who enters the army but objects to that, may object and may say, well, I'm a pacifist. I do not want to engage in war. They may partake in the military in another way, kind of perhaps behind the scenes, logistics or something like that. But they object to having to fight, to kill someone, ultimately. So absolute pacifism, then more into pacifism, non-violent resistance. We then enter into the ancient Christian idea known as just war. We will look more deeply into the theory of just war, but this idea is that there are certain conditions, certain circumstances that require nations, states to engage in war for the sake of reinstating peace, covering, rectifying injustices. What perhaps might be a modern conflict that might, I'm not saying it is at this point, but might fall into just war? Any of them?
At least on the surface, that's what
there are things like that shortly after the terrorist attacks in 2001, there was arguments of striving for, seeking, to oppose the ideas with those who did these terrible injustices on a national level, at least. Others. What was the last great conflict that we fell into before 2000s? Right?
War.
Perhaps thinking a little bit farther back. World War II.
The Great War.
Perhaps, yeah. And we can look into that because we need to talk more about, there are certain conditions that must fall under just war, or something to be a just war. Now, this can have two kinds of scales. It can be done with what's known as discrimination and proportionality. Or it can be done with proportionality only. So, what do these two mean? Discrimination, first of all, means the targeting of combatants alone. So, discrimination is the avoidance of targeting non-combatants. The general public, the wounded, prisoners. So you discriminate who you target in offering this just war. The just war is a limited violent resistance. It's war, so it is violent. Proportionality means the use of military force that is enough to achieve the goal or the end of this war. And of course, doing it without disproportionate collateral damage. Both can kind of, discrimination and proportionality can kind of go in hand. So there is just war utilizing discrimination and proportionality, but then there is perhaps just war that uses proportionality only. You may not necessarily, you do not discriminate, but you use the force that's necessary. The last, last and most aggressive form of war, actually, it's called total war. Total war is unlimited violent resistance. The goal of total war is to win at any cost. Yes?
So in a situation like World War II, could you argue that it was both a total war and a just war?
Well, I say we need to, in distinguishing all of this, we have to distinguish two different things as far as war, and we're going to get into those. There are two things for offering a justification or the carrying out, the execution of war. There is these Latin terms. The first is jus ad bellum, which means kind of the justification or the reasoning to go to war. Ad bellum is to or into war. Versus jus in bello, justification or execution in the war. So this first one is why you're going to war. This second one is how you're doing it. Those are two different groups, two different understandings. You can have moral reasons to go to war, but that doesn't mean you get to use immoral means to carry it out. So this may kind of pass the test, but you may fail in doing this. And we'll look at that some, especially in the context of modern wars, not just World War II. But World War II is kind of the biggest one because that's probably the last major war pretty much anybody's fought. So, but this is kind of the scale of aggressive response to injustice, especially in the context of nations and war, from absolute pacifism all the way down to total war. Those of you who enjoy your war games like Hearts of Iron or something like that, most of you probably practice something more like this. Just throw them all out and just achieve victory. That's all that matters, right? It's not just. Now, what we will see ultimately in understanding this is from a Catholic moral perspective. The two positions that are normally acceptable are pacifism, I'm going to put in my stars, and just war utilizing discrimination and proportionality. Absolute pacifism is usually only perhaps in an individual basis, not on a national basis. A unless one is heavily kind of overwhelmed or outnumbered. So pacifism and just war using discrimination and proportionality, not this more aggressive form of proportionality only. So what is this just war theory? How is it one can justify war? The main tenets of the just war theory come from the ancient world. Many of the ancient theologians, and talking and thinking about this. And obviously thinking about this in a time with far more wars or national violence than in our own day. And this is the time of, especially of the fading Roman Empire, hordes of barbarians, invading into Europe and things like that. This was a major topic, but it's been a major topic more and more, especially as weapons have gotten more and more effective at inflicting violence on others. So first of all, this looking at this just war theory is talking about that justification for going to war, the jus ad bellum. Just war theory is talking about, is kind of a checklist for entering a war. There is a difference, of course, in carrying out a war, as we talked about. This is that jus ad bellum. Be sure to understand that difference. First of all, there must be a just cause for going to war. There must be some injustice or some disturbance of the peace of the area, or perhaps on a grand scale of the world, that is inflicted by some aggressor. And this damage or this injustice that is inflicted must be lasting, grave, and certain. It must be lasting. It is not something that temporarily happens. The random suppression of a riot may not necessarily be lasting. It must be grave. It must be something that is supremely serious and supremely harmful. So the continued imprisonment of people based on a certain condition or perhaps a certain ethnicity or a certain race would be a grave reason. And it must be certain. No rumor mongering, but to have certain knowledge that this is happening. This is being done. Second, this must be seen as the last resort, not as the first response. What is the ultimate, what is the normal means that nations have to work these things out? Diplomacy, right. They are meant to organize these things on a diplomatic manner, to speak with one another. If that doesn't work, if appeals to other authorities have either been exhausted or deemed ineffective, then the war is seen as the last possible action that can be carried out to overcome this lasting, grave, and certain injustice that needs to be eliminated or reduced. So just cause, last resort. There must also be a probability of success. Why? Because you're engaging in violent resistance. You are putting people's lives on the line. You need to know that you can carry this out with some degree of success. Because otherwise you are wasting people's lives and trying to overcome this just cause through this last resort because you're not going to succeed. This is like if the Vatican tries to resist some injustice by Italy. You know the Vatican is its own separate nation, right? Technically the smallest, depending on your definition of what a nation is.
One of the few you can walk around in a day.
A day, oof, afternoon. The Vatican does not have much of a military, obviously. Doesn't have many citizens, obviously. So the Vatican says Italy, its only neighbor, is committing some grave injustice and goes to war, it's going to get crushed. Probably just by the Roman police officer corps. Not even the actual Italian military. Doesn't have that many. So there needs to be an actual probability of success, that you can succeed. Lastly, there is the sense of comparative justice. Since you are going to war, you are engaging in violence. Again, violence usually causes other sorts of evils or disorders, right? It wounds people, it kills people. So you may harm or even destroy families. Wars take place somewhere, right? And not necessarily in designated zones. You may involve places, it may even close into involving the ordinary public, even though you're not trying to target them. Marching through cities, battling through cities and countrysides. So the use of arms in the sense of comparative justice, the use of arms, the use of military or violent force must not produce evils and disorders graver than the evil that's to be eliminated. So remember, this is all to be done because there is some lasting, grave, certain evil, injustice, or wrong that needs to be overcome. So what you do in the war should not be worse than what you're trying to overcome. So, remember, this is all going into war. This is not carrying out the war. This is at least justifying going to war. Let's take a couple test cases. U.S. Civil War. What happened? Certain states felt that their rights or their ability to govern themselves was being overruled or threatening to be overruled by the federal government. They split because they wanted to rule themselves. The U.S. federal government sought to stop that, even as those states set up their own government, their own legislative forces, their own constitution or governmental documents and all of that. Did the U.S. have a just cause to go to war against the South?
No, they didn't.
Riley says no. What do you say?
Going off like the different tenets of the theory.
Well, just going off the just cause for now.
I'd say yes.
Okay. Riley, why do you say no?
Well, because they wanted to end slavery, they thought it was wrong, especially in the southern part, as the South kept on using its slaves and burning them, taking their children away.
Well, I was asking, so that's what the U.S. said was the reason to do that. So the South said that the U.S. didn't have the right to take that away. So does that mean the U.S. has a just cause for war? Not the South. I'm talking the U.S.
I don't think so.
No, I would say the argument there is yes. And I would say, does the South have a just cause for war? Well, but we would argue that there is a higher justice than just what we think or what we want. There are some things that are so evil that they need to be overcome or done in an evil manner. So, was it the last resort?
For who? For which side?
For war to happen, just for either side. Was it the last resort? Was forming armies and going to battle with each other the last resort?
Yes, because they've been arguing over the fact over this issue for years.
More than that.
That was just when
The heated arguments were about 30 years. It had been argued from almost the beginning of the country, from the beginning of the Constitution. Others say yes or no. Was it the last resort? In a certain sense, it pretty much was. There had been, as many of those states began to secede, to separate, there were kind of peace delegations and whatnot, just to say, let us go, and, you do what you want, and we're going to do what we want. Abraham Lincoln, the incoming president, argued, no, this was insurrection, that you had formed an agreement and you are a part of this country, and we have every right to ensure that, especially because of what you are supporting. Was there a probability of success as far as either side? Was there a probability of success? Both thought so. Both thought at least that. Did they, was there at least the idea of using comparative justice?
Towards the beginning,
Yes. Remember, this is entering into war. This is not carrying it out.
Oh, okay. Then yes.
Yeah, because there was still that classical idea of combat is done separate from cities and areas where people are. World War II, the American entry, let's focus on that. The American entry into World War II. When did we formally enter the Second World War?
December 41.
Right. We formally declared war against Japan, Italy, and Germany after Pearl Harbor. and after the declaration of war by Germany, at least, in the same time. Was there a just cause for entering the Second World War? What was the just cause? What would you say is the just cause? Why Pearl Harbor? That was just them, bombing a couple of battleships. Why was that enough to justify it? Yeah.
It was a completely unprovoked attack.
Right.
They just kind of came out. No, it was just like 9/11.
Right. Not disagreeing, but why is the destruction of, battleships and ships get destroyed in war also, so why was that alone enough to justify it?
Because of what the Japanese were doing in the war. Not only a couple of ships destroyed and lost, had the same enemy that did that was supporting and cooperating with someone who was committing much worse atrocities. As well as the Japanese doing things like that in China as well.
That was awesome. Yeah.
They were harming civilians and not militants.
They were very much targeting civilians. The just cause was already there before Pearl Harbor. By December of 41, Hitler pretty much dominated all of Europe. He had overtaken France, imposed occupation or even a puppet state there, taken over most of Eastern Europe, was at that point invading the Soviet Union, so was marching over most of Europe. Japan, at that point, had been in a years-long conflict with China, had been invading territories in the East Indies, the Dutch East Indies, even territory claimed by Australia, other places like the Philippines, which had been a kind of a territory of the United States at that point. So the just cause had already been there. You could say that Pearl Harbor is kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. It's like, no, they're finally actually attacking us. They're not just attacking allies or other people. They're actually attacking us. Which is what drove public opinion in favor of entering the war. Public opinion was greatly against entering the war because many Americans up to that point were very much, well, that's all happening over there. And yes, it's bad. It's all fine here. We're safe, we're fine, there's no issues. So there was a just cause. Was it the last resort? Was our entry into World War II the last resort? Yes? If I say no? Pretty much, yes. Most of the American diplomats have been working as almost as kind of a neutral power, since we were not actively involved in the war, as kind of a neutral power, trying to bring about some peace and whatnot, but it really didn't succeed. What was the great diplomatic adventure that was thought to appease Hitler, but didn't actually?
That was it. That might have been.
So the great one was the Prime Minister at the time, of the UK, Neville Chamberlain, basically giving away the area known as the Sudetenland, which is the boundary between kind of Germany and modern-day Nazi Germany claimed, it was majority German, so it belonged to Germany. So, they signed it away to say, all right, it's yours, shut up now. Like, stop complaining. And Hitler didn't, as history showed. So there had been, and even even for the UK, in the midst of the fighting, as it began in 1940, as the Nazis, swept through France, there was fear that they were so strong that they would overwhelm and even invade England early in 1940, and the British that almost felt that they weren't strong enough to deal with it. So yes, the Americans, that was basically a last resort. Was there a probability of success from the American side? Yes, pretty much. I mean, one of the most populated nations at that time, factory and industry completely unaffected by the war. The probably biggest hindrance was that we were so far away. We're separated by 2 oceans, an ocean on each side from the combatants. Lastly, comparative justice. Was the use of arms, the use of violent resistance, going to cause, or thought it was going to cause, any evils graver than that which was to be eliminated?
Not at all, considering what Japan and Germany were doing to civilians.
Right. The reports of the abuse of Chinese by Japanese, especially the infamous rape of Nanking. The reports of the abuse of Jews at that point by the Nazis, though not necessarily the start of the camps yet or anything like that, but also the abuse of other nationalities, the abuse of the just rolling over other countries. We see the map up here. That's Europe in the interwar period. Germany basically occupied about a third of it and was starting to push their way into Russia. In December of 41, it looked like they were about to take Moscow and all but crush the Soviet Union because of the ineffective resistance of the Soviet armies. Their own fault, but that was seen as immensely unjust. America didn't seek to take those lands for themselves, but to allow them to have their own self-determination. So at least entering into the war, at least on the part of World War II, the Americans at least checked that off. Now, the conduct in war, we'll have to see the next time. We'll talk about that quite a bit more. But for now, any questions or thoughts on any of that? Yeah.
I had a question regarding the scale of conflict.
Yeah.
Where would absolute neutrality, I guess not absolute neutrality in general, fall in warfare? Like what the Swiss did.
That would probably be kind of in between pacifism and absolute pacifism, because the Swiss did not enter into war themselves, but they were quite willing and quite ready to defend themselves. So they may have offered probably more of pacifism, I would say, that neutrality would fall into. But we can talk about that more next class.